The morning fog still covered the damp sidewalks when Emily Watson adjusted the microphone for the third time, nervously checking the script in her hands. Beside her, David Johnson manipulated the camera with the familiarity of someone who had recorded thousands of human stories. At that busy corner near the central subway station, amidst the hurried comings and goings of Springfield workers, a grey-haired man observed the movement with keen eyes. His worn clothes contrasted with his upright posture and penetrating gaze that analyzed every detail around him. "Are you sure about this, Emily Watson?" David Johnson asked quietly, adjusting the lens focus. "This idea of faking a job interview seems to me—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the discomfort was evident in his tired expression. Emily Watson took a deep breath, her professional ambition battling a pang of guilt that insisted on surfacing. "It's for the show, David Johnson. We want to show how society treats these people. It's important." The man known to everyone simply as the Thomas Reynolds kept up his morning routine. First, he carefully organized his few belongings in a worn backpack. Then, he politely greeted each merchant who opened their shops. Mr. Richard Stevens, the Portuguese owner of the corner bar, was already preparing the glass of water he offered daily. "Good morning, Thomas Reynolds. How did you spend the night?" The merchant's thick accent mixed with the growing noise of the waking city. "Very well. Thank you, Mr. Richard Stevens. The night was pleasant, neither too cold nor too hot. Perfect for stargazing, although the light pollution of this fascinating metropolis makes such an activity somewhat challenging." The elaborate reply made the Portuguese smile. After months of serving water to that peculiar man, he was still surprised by his refined vocabulary and insightful observations on various subjects. Emily Watson observed the scene from afar, making mental notes. The production of the Invisible Reality program sought impactful stories, and that mysterious man seemed perfect for the segment on social prejudices. She had spent weeks studying the area, talking to merchants, preparing her approach. Now, with the camera ready and the fake job proposal rehearsed, it was time to act. "Excuse me, sir?" Emily Watson approached with a professional smile, while David Johnson discreetly followed, camera in hand. The man lifted his eyes, and for a moment, Emily Watson felt scrutinized with a disconcerting intensity. "Yes, young lady? How may I assist? You on this promising morning?" The way he spoke, choosing each word with surgical precision, made Emily Watson hesitate for a second. Recovering quickly, she began her prepared script. "My name is Emily Watson. I work for a human resources company. We are looking for people for cleaning assistant positions in commercial offices. Would you be interested?" The Thomas Reynolds tilted his head slightly, a gesture that Emily Watson would later interpret as a deep analysis of the situation. "I greatly appreciate your kindness in considering me for such an opportunity. Could you please elucidate the specifics of this position? Hours, location, benefits offered?" David Johnson, behind the camera, frowned. There was something about that man that didn't fit the usual stereotype. The way he expressed himself, his posture, even the way he gestured while speaking, all suggested a refined education, incompatible with his apparent situation. Emily Watson continued with the charade, describing fictional details about the position. The Thomas Reynolds listened attentively, occasionally asking surprisingly specific questions about labor policies, rights, and regulations. "You mentioned that the company offers transportation vouchers. This is in accordance with Law 7.418 of 1985, I presume? And what about the night shift allowance? Does it comply with the consolidation of labor laws in its entirety?" The reporter felt beads of sweat forming on her forehead, despite the cool morning. How did this man know labor legislation so well? She improvised answers, trying to maintain the credibility of the situation, while her mind processed the implications of that unexpected knowledge. "I sense your hesitation, young Emily Watson." The Thomas Reynolds smiled gently, a smile that did not fully reach his observant eyes. "Do not worry. I understand that certain information may not be immediately available. Perhaps we could schedule a conversation later when you have all the necessary data." Mr. Richard Stevens watched the interaction from the bar's counter, cleaning glasses that were already spotless. He had known the Thomas Reynolds for months and knew that there was much more to that man than met the eye. Sometimes, late at night, when the crowd thinned out, they would talk about philosophy, history, even the complexities of the global economy. The Portuguese treasured those conversations, aware that he was in the presence of a brilliant mind trapped in mysterious circumstances. Emily Watson accepted the Thomas Reynolds' suggestion, agreeing to return the next day. As she walked away with David Johnson, she couldn't hide her perplexity. "Did you hear how he talks? The questions he asked?" David Johnson nodded, still processing what he had recorded. "There's something very strange here, Emily Watson. This man, he is not what he seems." The Thomas Reynolds watched them leave, a slight smile dancing on his lips. He opened his worn notebook and made a few quick notes in his impeccable handwriting. "Day 247, he wrote. "First contact established. Profile, ambitious young journalist, probably working on some television program. Approach, false job offer. Initial reaction, surprise at the unexpected. Hypothesis, they will return." He closed the notebook and carefully stored it away. Beside him, an elderly lady selling flowers approached. "Thomas Reynolds, could you help me? My grandson has a school assignment on Dom Casmurro, but I don't understand anything about it." He smiled genuinely this time. "It would be a pleasure, Mrs. Rosa. Machado de Assis is always excellent company. You see, the central question of the work is not whether Capitu betrayed Bentinho or not, but rather how doubt eroded the narrator's soul." As he explained the nuances of Machado's literature, other homeless people began to gather, forming a small circle around him. It was a common scene at that corner, the Thomas Reynolds sharing knowledge with anyone willing to listen, transforming the cold sidewalk into an improvised classroom. Emily Watson spent the rest of the day restless. At her desk in the newsroom, surrounded by monitors and papers, she couldn't concentrate on other stories. Something about that encounter disturbed her deeply. She opened her browser and began to search, typing vague terms. Thomas Reynolds homeless Springfield, intellectual living on the streets, educated man homeless downtown. The results were generic, nothing specific about the man she had met. Frustrated, she decided to broaden her search, looking for similar cases in other cities, stories of highly educated people who chose to live on the streets. She found some interesting accounts, but nothing that explained the mystery of the Thomas Reynolds. "Emily Watson, you're obsessed." David Johnson approached with 2 cups of coffee. "It's just another story for the program." She accepted the coffee but shook her head. "No, David Johnson. There's something different here. Did you see how he talked about the CLT? How he knew specific details of the legislation? And that posture, the vocabulary?" "Maybe he had a better life before," David Johnson suggested, shrugging. "It happens. People lose jobs. Families fall apart. Addictions destroy careers. The street is full of sad stories." Emily Watson bit her lip, thoughtful. Yes, David Johnson was right, but her journalistic instinct told her there was something more, something she needed to uncover. The next day, Emily Watson returned to the corner, this time without the camera. David Johnson protested, arguing that they needed the footage for the show, but she insisted on going alone first. "I want to gain his trust," she explained. "Then, we'll bring the equipment." The Thomas Reynolds was in his usual spot, reading a coverless book, the pages yellowed with time. Upon seeing her approach, he carefully closed the book and greeted her with a nod. "Punctuality, a rare virtue in today's times, Emily Watson. I see you brought the promised information." Emily Watson had prepared a folder with false documents about the fictitious company, but something stopped her from continuing with the charade. She sat on the bench beside him, temporarily abandoning the script. "Actually, sir, Thomas Reynolds, as they call you, I would like to get to know you better before we talk about work." He studied her for long seconds, his penetrating eyes seeming to read far beyond the words. "Interesting change of approach. Very well. What would you like to know? Although I must warn you that appearances often deceive, and stories are not always what they seem." "Why do they call you Thomas Reynolds?" Emily Watson began with the most obvious question. He smiled, a melancholic smile that momentarily transformed his weary features. I suppose it is due to my propensity to share knowledge. See that young man over there? He pointed to a boy across the street. He is studying engineering at the public university. Sometimes I help him with differential calculus. It's fascinating how derivatives can be applied to understand instantaneous changes in complex systems. Emily Watson blinked, surprised. You understand calculus? The question slipped out before she could contain it. The Thomas Reynolds laughed, a rich and genuine sound. Among other things, but tell me about yourself, Emily Watson. What truly brings you to this corner? I doubt it's just to recruit cleaning assistants. The young reporter suddenly felt exposed, as if the roles had reversed and she was the one being interviewed. She decided to risk a half-truth. I work in communication. I'm interested in human stories, in understanding how people arrive at different life situations. Ah, a modern storyteller. The Thomas Reynolds nodded appreciatively. Like Herodotus, the father of history, you seek narratives that reveal truths about the human condition. Commendable, although I question, do the stories we tell reveal more about the observed or about the observers? The conversation flowed for another hour, with the Thomas Reynolds demonstrating impressive knowledge on various subjects. They talked about Brazilian literature, and he quoted entire passages from Guimarães Rosa from memory. They discussed the global economy, and he clearly explained the nuances of monetary policy. When Emily Watson casually mentioned an art exhibition at Art View Gallery, he elaborated on the Brazilian modernist movement with the passion of a specialist. Did you have formal education? Emily Watson finally asked, unable to contain her curiosity. The Thomas Reynolds fell silent for a moment, watching the street's movement. We all have some form of education, Emily Watson, some in classrooms, others in the universities of life. Knowledge recognizes no physical or social boundaries. An evasive answer, Emily Watson noted, but revealing in its own evasion. Mr. Richard Stevens approached with the customary glass of water and a plate of food. Thomas Reynolds, there's some leftover from lunch. I thought you might be hungry. The man accepted gratefully, but Emily Watson observed that before eating, he set aside half of the portion. For Mrs. Maria, he explained, noticing her questioning look. She struggles to get enough food. Solidarity, here's what keeps us human, don't you think? Emily Watson nodded, increasingly intrigued. She said goodbye, promising to return, her mind buzzing with questions. Who was that man really? Why would someone with such erudition choose to live on the streets? There was a story there, she felt, much bigger than the original pitch for the program. In the following weeks, Emily Watson established a routine. She visited the Thomas Reynolds regularly, sometimes with David Johnson and the camera, other times alone. The recordings for the program continued, but her focus had shifted. It was no longer about exposing prejudices through a cruel prank, but documenting the complexity of that enigmatic man. The Thomas Reynolds, for his part, seemed to accept her presence with a mix of amusement and resignation. He answered her questions eloquently, but always maintained an invisible barrier, never revealing concrete details about his past. When directly questioned, he skillfully diverted the subject, transforming personal inquiries into philosophical discussions about identity, belonging, and the social constructs that define who we are. You see, Emily Watson, he said one afternoon as they watched the sunset tint the buildings gold, identity is a fluid construct. Who I was yesterday may not be who I am today, and who will I be tomorrow? Well, that depends on countless variables, doesn't it? David Johnson, filming discreetly, captured every nuance of those conversations. In his decades of experience, he had never encountered anyone like the Thomas Reynolds. There was a depth to his words, layers of meaning that only revealed themselves after multiple analyses of the recordings. One afternoon, while the Thomas Reynolds was helping a group of students with history questions, Emily Watson again noticed his perfect handwriting as he made notes for them. The precision of the strokes, the elegance of the cursive writing, all suggested years of academic practice. Discreetly, she photographed one of the pages. Later, in the newsroom, she enlarged the image and studied every detail. The writing was impeccable, but it was the content that impressed her. a sophisticated analysis of Brazilian social movements in the 20th century with references to authors she barely knew. In the corner of the page, a note in Latin, Veritas vos liberabit. The truth will set you free. Emily Watson, you need to see this. David Johnson called her over to his computer. He had spent hours editing the recordings, creating a compilation of the conversations with the Thomas Reynolds. Look at all the different languages he used in the last few weeks. On the screen, a montage showed the Thomas Reynolds speaking in Portuguese, quoting in Latin, explaining etymologies in ancient Greek, translating signs in French for lost tourists, and even helping a German immigrant with directions in his native language. The fluency was impressive, the pronunciation impeccable. David Johnson, we need to find out who he really is. Emily Watson felt the adrenaline of journalistic discovery coursing through her veins. It's not just a matter of curiosity anymore. This man has a story, and it's our responsibility to tell it. But uncovering the truth about the Thomas Reynolds would prove to be more challenging than they imagined. Each clue led to a dead end, each revelation only deepening the mystery. And in the meantime, the grey-haired man continued in his corner, observing the world pass by, making his careful notes, sharing wisdom with anyone willing to listen, guarding his secrets with the care of one who carries something too precious to be revealed prematurely. That night in his notebook, the Thomas Reynolds wrote, Day 289. The journalist persists. Genuine curiosity replacing initial superficial interest. Progress observed. Relevant question. When will the appropriate moment be? Variable still under analysis. The truth, as always, awaits its time. 2 months had passed since their first encounter, and Emily Watson felt she was on the brink of an important discovery. Little did she know that her quest for the truth would lead her down unexpected paths, revealing not only the Thomas Reynolds' story, but also uncomfortable truths about the society they both inhabited. On a particularly cold morning, Emily Watson arrived earlier than usual. The Thomas Reynolds was already awake, wrapped in a donated blanket, writing in his notebook. Seeing her, he quickly tucked the notebook away, but not before she caught a glimpse of complex equations covering the page. Good morning, Emily Watson. You're early today. The best discoveries often happen when we alter our usual patterns. He smiled, that enigmatic smile she had learned to recognize as a sign that there was more in the subtext. Thomas Reynolds, I need to be honest with you. Emily Watson took a deep breath, making a decision that would change the course of her investigation. I don't work for a human resources company. I'm a journalist, and initially I came here for their story, but she hesitated, searching for the right words, but now it's different. I truly want to understand your story. The Thomas Reynolds did not show surprise. On the contrary, his eyes sparkled with what seemed like approval. Honesty. I admire that, Emily Watson. I always knew your true intentions, of course. The cameras are not exactly discreet, and your colleague David Johnson, though competent, has a habit of murmuring technical instructions when he thinks no one is listening. Emily Watson blushed, feeling simultaneously embarrassed and relieved. You knew all along? The Thomas Reynolds nodded calmly. Naturally, but I found the experiment interesting. After all, we are all constantly playing roles, aren't we? You were pretending to be a recruiter, I was pretending to believe. The question is, when does the performance end and reality begins? Then why did you continue? Emily Watson asked, genuinely curious. Why didn't you confront me from the start? Because, my dear, the Thomas Reynolds adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. Sometimes the best stories emerge when we allow them to develop organically. Besides, your transformation from journalist seeking a sensationalist story to someone genuinely interested in understanding was instructive. He paused, observing the morning movement intensifying on the street. You know, Emily Watson, there is a concept in anthropology called participant observation. The researcher inserts themselves into the reality they wish to study, becoming part of it to truly understand it. But there is always the ethical question. To what extent does the presence of the observer alter the observed reality? Emily Watson frowned, processing the implications. Are you saying that... She stopped, a suspicion forming. Are you studying? Me too. The Thomas Reynolds laughed, a genuine sound that echoed through the morning. We all study one another, Emily Watson. That's how we navigate the complexity of human relations. But yes, I confess I found it fascinating to observe how your perceptions and prejudices were changing throughout our interactions. Prejudices? Emily Watson felt defensive. Don't take offense. We all have them. What did you expect to find? A victim of circumstances, someone deserving of pity, a sad case to tug at your audience's heartstrings. The Thomas Reynolds spoke without accusation, simply stating facts. And instead, you found an enigma, Emily Watson completed. Someone who doesn't fit any simple category. Exactly, and that bothers you, doesn't it? Because it challenges the convenient narratives that the media likes to construct. I am neither the pitiful one deserving charity, nor the lazy one who chose an easy life. I am just complex, like we all are, if someone takes the trouble to look beyond the surface. Mr. Richard Stevens approached with breakfast for both. Emily Watson, it's good to see you here again. The Thomas Reynolds has spoken well of you. The Portuguese winked conspiratorially before returning to his bar. Mr. Richard Stevens seems to like you, the Thomas Reynolds observed, sipping the hot coffee. He has a good heart. 30 years in Brazil, he built his small business with sweat and determination. His wife passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. The children want him to return to Portugal, but he refuses. He says his roots are now here, on this sidewalk, serving coffee and water to those in need. Emily Watson noted how the Thomas Reynolds knew intimate details about the people around him. How you know a lot about everyone here. Listening is a lost art, he replied. People talk, share their pains and joys, but few really listen. I have time. It's one of the luxuries of my situation. Thomas Reynolds. Emily Watson decided to be direct. Were you really a teacher? I mean, professionally? He fell silent for a long moment, his eyes lost in distant memories. What defines a teacher, Emily Watson? The diploma on the wall? The salary at the end of the month? Or the act of sharing knowledge, awakening curiosity, transforming perspectives? Both, I would say, Emily Watson replied. But sir, you're dodging the question. Am I? The Thomas Reynolds smiled. Or am I trying to make you think about the categories we use to classify the world? Look at that lady there. He pointed to a well-dressed woman hurrying across the street. Lawyer, 2 kids, recently divorced. How do I know? Observation. The briefcase, the graduation ring, the white mark where a wedding band once was, the tired yet determined demeanor. Now, what does she see when she looks at me? A homeless person, Emily Watson answered honestly. Exactly. And this immediate categorization determines our entire potential interaction. She sees me as a category, not as an individual. It's efficient from a cognitive standpoint. The brain needs to categorize quickly to navigate the world. But the price of this efficiency is the loss of nuance, of individual complexity. David Johnson arrived with the equipment, greeting both of them. Sorry for the delay. Hellish traffic. He began setting up the camera, already familiar with the routine. David Johnson, the Thomas Reynolds greeted. How's your daughter? Is she feeling better from the flu? The cameraman stopped, surprised. How? I mentioned that. Last week, you were worried. You called home twice during the recording. I hope she's better. Yes, she is, thank you. David Johnson exchanged a glance with Emily Watson. The Thomas Reynolds' observational skills continued to amaze them. That day, during the recording, the Thomas Reynolds spoke about Springfield's urban history with such depth that Emily Watson decided to fact-check later. He described the evolution of the downtown area, demographic changes, the economic cycles that shaped the city. Every detail, she discovered later, was precisely correct. You must have studied a lot about the city, Emily Watson commented after they turned off the camera. Studying, living, observing. They are all valid methods of acquiring knowledge, the Thomas Reynolds replied. But yes, I've always been fascinated by how cities are living organisms, constantly transforming. Springfield, in particular, is a fascinating laboratory of social dynamics. A young student approached timidly. Thomas Reynolds, Sorry to bother you, but could you help me with a quantum physics problem? Of course, my young friend. Sit down. The Thomas Reynolds made space on the bench. Emily Watson, David Johnson, do you mind? Education doesn't wait. During the next hour, Emily Watson watched in fascination as the Thomas Reynolds explained complex concepts of quantum mechanics with impressive clarity. He used creative analogies, drew diagrams in the air, cited famous experiments. The student, initially confused, began to understand, his eyes lighting up with comprehension. Thank you, Thomas Reynolds. You explain better than my university, Thomas Reynolds, the young man enthusiastically thanked before leaving. Quantum physics, Emily Watson murmured. What else do you know? The most interesting question, Emily. Watson, is not what I know, but why this knowledge surprises when it comes from someone in my situation. If I were wearing a suit and tie behind a mahogany desk, my knowledge would be expected, not remarkable. The content is the same, only the context changes. What does this tell us about how we judge competence and value? Emily Watson had no answer. Every conversation with the Thomas Reynolds made her question her own perceptions and prejudices. She began to realize that the story there was not just about an educated man living on the streets, but about how society categorizes and judges based on superficial appearances. That night, Emily Watson stayed late at the office reviewing all the collected material. She had hours of footage, pages of notes, but felt she was still just scratching the surface. She decided to expand her research. I need your help, she told David Johnson the next day. Let's look into university archives, academic records, anything that might give us a clue about who he was. Emily Watson, are you sure? David Johnson was hesitant. What if he doesn't want to be found? What if there's a reason for him being where he is? Then at least we'll understand the reason, Emily Watson insisted. I'm not going to expose him without consent, but I need to know. It's more than curiosity now, David Johnson. It's about understanding how someone with so much to offer ends up like this. The following weeks were filled with intense research. Emily Watson visited university libraries, consulted online archives, searched through academic publications. The Thomas Reynolds had casually mentioned authors and specific theories too obscure to be general knowledge. She began looking for work on urban sociology, studies on social inequality, anything that could connect to the knowledge he demonstrated. It was on a rainy afternoon, while sifting through digitized archives of an academic conference from 20 years ago, that Emily Watson froze. On the screen, a black and white photograph showed a panel of experts. The third from the left, the resemblance was undeniable, despite the years and different circumstances. Dr. Roberto Alcantara, she read the caption. Thomas Reynolds of Urban Sociology, University of Springfield, author of Invisible Visible, a study on social marginalization in Brazilian metropolises. Emily Watson printed the page with trembling hands. Could it be? She began searching for more information about Dr. Alcantara. She found academic articles, citations in other researchers' papers, even a glowing review of his book in a specialized magazine. Then, around 15 years ago, nothing, as if he had simply disappeared. She decided not to confront the Thomas Reynolds immediately. Instead, she sought out the mentioned book. She found a copy in the university library, its pages yellowed with age. As she read, she immediately recognized the style. The same eloquence, the same depth of analysis, the same social concerns that Thomas Reynolds demonstrated daily. One chapter in particular caught her attention. The Observed Observer, Ethical Dilemmas of Social Research. In it, the author discussed the limits between academic observation and lived experience, questioning whether it was truly possible to understand marginalization without experiencing it. To truly understand social invisibility, one passage said, perhaps it is necessary to become invisible, but to what extent can the researcher immerse themselves without losing themselves? And more importantly, having seen the world through the eyes of the marginalized, how can one return to the ivory tower of academia without carrying that transformation? Emily Watson reread the paragraph several times. The implications were disturbing. Could it be that the Thomas Reynolds, Dr. Alcantara, had taken his research to the extreme? That he had chosen to live on the streets as a definitive study of social marginalization? The next day, she returned to the corner with renewed determination, but also with caution. The Thomas Reynolds was in his usual spot, animatedly discussing with Mary Thompson the influence of Cordell literature on Brazilian popular culture. "Ah, Emily Watson," he greeted her. "I was just explaining to Mary Thompson how the metric structure of the Cordell relates to ancient oral traditions. It's fascinating how popular culture preserves artistic forms that academia sometimes overlooks." Emily Watson sat down, observing him with new eyes. Now that she suspected his identity, small details made sense. The way he gestured while explaining concepts, the professorial habit of asking Socratic questions, even the way he organized his belongings, suggested the methodology of someone accustomed to systematic research. "Thomas Reynolds," she began cautiously, "have you ever thought about writing about your experiences, your observations on life on the street, about the people you've met?" He studied her for a long moment, and Emily Watson had the uncomfortable feeling that he knew exactly where she was trying to go. "Writing requires distance, Emily Watson. How can I write about something I am still living? The experience is still in process, the observations still accumulating. Jumping to conclusions would be unscientific." The choice of words did not go unnoticed. Unscientific. Was it a subtle confirmation or just coincidence? David Johnson arrived late again, murmuring apologies about traffic. As he prepared the equipment, the Thomas Reynolds made a casual observation that chilled Emily Watson. "You know, there's an interesting theory about how the act of observation alters the observed phenomenon. Heisenberg spoke about subatomic particles, but the principle applies to social sciences as well. You two, for instance, with your regular visits, have already changed the dynamics of this corner. People treat me differently when the cameras are present. The reality you capture is, therefore, a reality altered by your presence." "Sorry," Emily Watson said, suddenly aware of the impact of their actions. "It wasn't our intention." "Don't apologize," the Thomas Reynolds gently interrupted her. "It's inevitable, but it's important to be aware of it. After all," he smiled enigmatically, "we are all simultaneously observers and observed, aren't we?" During the recording that day, the Thomas Reynolds spoke about networks of solidarity among homeless people, about the complex social hierarchies that existed on the streets, about survival strategies that went far beyond the stereotype of begging. Each observation was insightful, grounded, clearly the result of prolonged systematic observation. "It's impressive how you understand these dynamics," Emily Watson commented when they finished. "Living is the best way to understand," he simply replied. "Theories are important, but experience. Experience teaches what no book can convey." "Sue," Richard Stevens approached with lunch. "Thomas Reynolds, today we have feijoada. I saved a special portion for you." The Portuguese lowered his voice. "And there's a letter that arrived addressed to you. They left it at the bar." Emily Watson saw the Thomas Reynolds tense momentarily. A letter? Who would know to find him there? He accepted the envelope with apparent calm, but Emily Watson noticed how his fingers trembled slightly as he put it in his pocket. "Aren't you going to open it?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. "Every correspondence deserves privacy and the right moment for reading," the Thomas Reynolds replied. But there was a new tension in his voice. The rest of the afternoon went normally, but Emily Watson sensed that the Thomas Reynolds was distracted. His eyes occasionally drifted to the pocket where he had stored the letter. When she and David Johnson were getting ready to leave, he called out to her, "Emily Watson, may I ask you a hypothetical question?" Without waiting for a response, he continued, "If you discovered that someone is not who they seem to be, that there is a bigger story behind appearances, what would you do with that information?" Emily Watson felt her heart race. Was it the opening she had been waiting for? "It would depend," she answered carefully. "If the person has reasons to keep their privacy, I would respect that. But if the story could help others, make a difference, perhaps it would be worth telling. With consent, of course." The Thomas Reynolds nodded slowly. "Consent. Yes, it is fundamental. But what if the story hasn't yet reached its end? What if revealing it prematurely compromises its greater purpose? Then I would wait, Emily Watson said without hesitation. Some stories need to mature before they can be told. A genuine smile illuminated the Thomas Reynolds' face. You have learned well, Emily Watson. Very well. That night, Emily Watson lay awake. The conversation had been heavy with subtext, with unspoken truths. She was almost certain now that the Thomas Reynolds was Dr. Alcantara, but the confirmation raised more questions than answers. Why would a respected academic choose to live on the streets? How long did he intend to maintain this life? And more importantly, what was the greater purpose he had mentioned? She picked up Dr. Alcantara's book again, leafing through to the preface. A dedication caught her attention. For all the invisible ones who make our society possible. One day their stories will be heard. Emily Watson closed the book, a comprehension beginning to form. What if the Thomas Reynolds was not just observing? What if he was collecting stories, experiences, preparing something greater? The letter he had received, would it be from an editor, from former colleagues, or something completely different? She decided she would continue documenting, continue learning, but with a new perspective. She was no longer pursuing a sensationalist story. She was witnessing something extraordinary, a man who had given up everything to truly understand those whom society chose not to see. And perhaps, just perhaps, by being part of this journey of understanding, she was transforming as well. The Thomas Reynolds was right. The best stories needed to mature. And Emily Watson sensed that this one was just beginning to reveal its true depth. With patience and respect, she would continue observing, learning, waiting for the moment when the complete story would be ready to be told. Because some truths are too big to be rushed, and some journeys only make sense when they reach their final destination. The next morning brought with it a typical fine drizzle of Springfield, transforming the city into a grey watercolor. Emily Watson arrived at the corner later than usual, delayed by an editorial meeting that questioned the direction of her report. 2 months, and we still don't have a finalized piece, her editor had complained. What exactly are you doing, Emily Watson? How to explain that she was witnessing something much larger than a simple article? How to convince the higher-ups that some stories required time to fully reveal themselves? She had improvised a response about the complexity of the topic, promising results soon, but the pressure was mounting. The Thomas Reynolds was not in his usual place. Emily Watson felt a pang of anxiety. In all these months, he had never been absent. Sue Richard Stevens waved from the bar's door. He's back there, Emily Watson. He seems to be different today. She found the Thomas Reynolds, sitting on the back steps of the building, sheltered from the drizzle. The letter from the previous day was open in his hands, and for the first time since she had met him, Emily Watson saw vulnerability in his eyes. I'm sorry, she began to move away, respecting his privacy. No, stay. His voice was hoarse. Perhaps he had time to share some burdens. Emily Watson sat beside him, waiting. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant noise of traffic and the soft patter of rain. You know what's ironic about studying social invisibility? The Thomas Reynolds finally spoke, still looking at the letter. You can become so good at it that you end up disappearing even from those who should always be able to find you. The letter, Emily Watson ventured. It's from my daughter. The words came out like a sigh. I haven't seen her in a long time. She found out where I am. She wants to understand. She wants me to come back. Emily Watson remained silent, realizing the magnitude of the moment. The Thomas Reynolds, she still struggled to think of him as Dr. Alcantara, was finally lowering his defenses. When I started this, he continued, it was supposed to be temporary, 6 months, maybe a year, total immersion to truly understand. But then, he paused, searching for words. Then I discovered that I was not just observing, I was living. The people I met, the stories I heard, the connections I formed. How can I go back to the ivory tower after seeing the world for real? But your family, Emily Watson said softly. Yes, The word carried the weight of years of difficult choices. My wife. Ex-wife now, I suppose. My daughter was 15. When I left, now she's a doctor, and I've lost all of that. Why don't you go back? Even if, temporarily. The Thomas Reynolds finally looked at her, and Emily Watson saw unshed tears in his eyes. Because I haven't finished yet. There's something I need to complete, a debt I need to pay. Not to them, but to all these. He gestured vaguely, indicating the street, the city, the invisibles who inhabited it. A debt of understanding, of testimony, of voice. He carefully folded the letter. I've spent years studying poverty and marginalization from the comfort of academia. I published articles that few read, gave lectures to audiences that already agreed with me. But what really changed? Nothing. I was just another academic talking about lives I didn't live. Emily Watson began to understand. So you decided to live. I decided to understand. There's a difference. Living on the streets doesn't automatically make me one of them. I always carry the privilege of my past, of my education, of my choices. But at least now, when I talk about social invisibility, I speak with real knowledge, not theoretical. David Johnson arrived, umbrella in hand, but stopped upon sensing the intensity of the moment. Emily Watson discreetly signaled for him to wait. Your daughter deserves an answer, Emily Watson said gently. Yes, but what answer can I give? Sorry, daughter, I chose strangers over you. Your father preferred research to witnessing your growth? The bitterness in his voice was palpable. Perhaps the truth, that you are trying to make a difference, that your work here has meaning. The Thomas Reynolds laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Meaning? Do you know how many people I've helped out of the streets? Truly helped, not just given advice or food? 3. In all these years, just 3. And how many have come to replace them? Dozens. It's like emptying the ocean with a thimble. But those 3 people, yes, for them it made a difference. Michael Carter now works as a security guard, has a small apartment. Maria returned to her family in the countryside. Pedro managed to finish school. Today he is a public school teacher. But what about the others? Those I couldn't reach. Those the system continues to chew up and spit out. Emily Watson realized that she was witnessing not only the Thomas Reynolds story, but his existential crisis. Years of observation and living had taken their toll. What do you plan to do? She asked. That's the question, isn't it? He tucked the letter into the inner pocket of his coat. I have enough material to write 10 books. Stories that need to be told. Voices that deserve to be heard. But to write them, I would need to leave here, and if I leave, you feel like you're abandoning them. Because I would be. The conviction in his voice was absolute. How can I sit in a comfortable office and write about Michael Carter, who still struggles with alcoholism every night? About Marta, who was kicked out of her home at 14 for being who she is? About Sue Antonio, a war veteran that the country forgot? But if you don't write, their stories die with you, Emily Watson argued. You said you have a debt to give them a voice. How do you fulfill that debt in silence? The Thomas Reynolds fell silent for a long moment. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clear and fresh. You ask difficult questions, Emily Watson. I have learned to appreciate them. I learned from the best teacher, she replied, eliciting his first genuine smile of the day. David Johnson finally approached. Sorry to interrupt, but production. Here's pressing. We need something concrete soon, or they're going to cancel the project. Emily Watson and the Thomas Reynolds exchanged a meaningful glance. David Johnson, the Thomas Reynolds said, what would you say to shifting the focus of the report? How so? Instead of a story about an educated homeless person, how about a series on the invisible lives of the city? Each episode focusing on a different person, their stories, their dreams, their struggles. I could facilitate the connections. David Johnson blinked, surprised. That would actually be incredible. But production... Leave production to me, Emily Watson interrupted, already visualizing the project. Thomas Reynolds, would you do this? Share these stories? on conditions. No sensationalism, no unnecessary exposure. Each person decides what they want to share, and the focus must be on humanizing them, not victimizing them. I completely agree. And more, the Thomas Reynolds continued, I want part of any profit or visibility generated to be reverted into concrete actions. It's not enough to tell stories if nothing changes afterward. Emily Watson felt the adrenaline of possibility. We can create partnerships with NGOs, reintegration programs. Now you're thinking like someone who wants to make a difference, not just get an audience. The Thomas Reynolds approved, but there's another condition. What? My identity remains protected. I am just the Thomas Reynolds. The focus should not be on me, but on those who truly matter. Emily Watson hesitated. The journalist in her wanted to reveal the full story, the University Thomas Reynolds who chose to live on the streets for his research. But the person she had become over these months understood the importance of the request. All right, she agreed. You are merely the facilitator, not the focus. Then we have an agreement. The Thomas Reynolds stood up, looking more animated. But first I need to respond to a letter. I need to explain to a young doctor why her father chose such an unconventional path, and perhaps suggest a coffee. After all, even dedicated researchers deserve breaks, right? Emily Watson smiled. Everyone deserves breaks, Thomas Reynolds, and second chances. In the following weeks, the project took shape. Emily Watson managed to convince the production team by presenting not one, but 12 potential stories, each more compelling than the last. The Thomas Reynolds, true to his word, facilitated meetings with homeless individuals who trusted him, people who would normally shy away from cameras and microphones. The first was Alice Turner, a 60-year-old woman who had been a primary school teacher before a series of personal tragedies led her to the streets. Her story of resilience and dignity in the face of adversity deeply touched the audience. Next came Lucas Evans, a young LGBTQ+ person expelled from home who survived making art from recycled materials. His talent was undeniable, and the exposure led a gallery to offer him a space to exhibit. Michael Carter, the former executive who lost everything in the economic crisis, shared his journey of rebuilding. Antonio, a veteran with post-traumatic stress, spoke about the abandonment faced by those who served the country. Maria, a single mother struggling not to lose custody of her children, revealed the complexities of being homeless while trying to maintain a family. Each episode was carefully crafted, respecting the dignity of the interviewees while not hiding the harsh realities of their lives. The Thomas Reynolds appeared occasionally, always from behind or in silhouette, guiding the conversations with questions that revealed depth and nuance. The impact was beyond what was expected. The audience not only watched but engaged. Donations to support organizations increased. People offered jobs, temporary housing, legal assistance. Lucas Evans sold his works, with the money funding a small studio. Michael Carter got a job through a business viewer. Maria received pro bono legal assistance to keep her children. See, the Thomas Reynolds said to Emily Watson during a break in filming, this is real impact, not statistics in an academic paper, but lives changing. You made this happen, Emily Watson replied. We did. You, David Johnson, the people who watched and acted, I just built bridges. And your daughter? Did you manage to meet with her? A gentle smile crossed her face. Next week, coffee in a neutral place. She said she wants to understand, not judge. It's more than I deserve. That's exactly what you deserve. The project continued for months, each story adding a layer to the complex mosaic of life on the streets of Springfield. Emily Watson noticed changes in herself as well. Her journalistic gaze had transformed, becoming more empathetic, more nuanced. She no longer sought sensational stories, but the human truth behind each situation. David Johnson, the veteran cameraman, who thought he had seen it all, found renewed purpose in his work. In 30 years of profession, he once said, I've never done anything so meaningful. But it was the Thomas Reynolds who underwent the most visible transformation. The weight he carried had lifted. He still lived on the streets, still maintained his routine of observation and help, but there was a lightness in his movements, a renewed brightness in his eyes. "You know," he told Emily Watson on a particularly beautiful afternoon, the golden sun illuminating the familiar corner, "I spent years searching for the perfect methodology to understand social exclusion. I read all the theorists, tested all the approaches, and in the end the answer was simple: genuine human connection. Not distant observation, but true participation." And now, what do you plan to do? Continue, but differently. Perhaps it's time to write again, but not from the distance of academia. Write from here, from this reality. And who knows, inspire other researchers to truly immerse themselves in their subjects of study, not just observe from afar. A book, several, but also actions, mentorship programs for young researchers, workshops on immersion methodologies, and continue here, being a bridge between worlds that insist on remaining separated. Emily Watson realized she was witnessing something rare, someone who had found their purpose and was living it fully despite the personal cost. "My daughter," the Thomas Reynolds continued, "suggested something interesting, that I keep one foot in each world. Some days at the university, sharing what I've learned, others here continuing to learn, building bridges not just between people, but between academic knowledge and street wisdom." Sounds perfect. Perfection doesn't exist, Emily Watson, but perhaps it's possible to find a balance that honors both my vocation and my personal responsibilities. The series of reports eventually came to an end, but its impact continued to reverberate. It won awards, inspired public policies, changed perceptions. More importantly, it changed lives. Not just those portrayed, but everyone involved. Emily Watson wrote in her final notes, "I sought a story about an educated man living on the streets. I found something much greater, a lesson about humanity, purpose, and the price and value of true knowledge. The Thomas Reynolds taught me that the best stories are not those we tell, but those we live and that inspire others to live differently." The Thomas Reynolds continued on his corner, but now with a renewed and expanded purpose. He sometimes disappeared for a few days, to visit his daughter, give a lecture, write a chapter, but he always returned because there, at that intersection of worlds, he had found his place. And Emily Watson? She continued telling stories, but with a depth that only comes from those who have learned to see beyond appearances. Each piece carried the fundamental lesson that Thomas Reynolds had taught. Everyone has a story that deserves to be heard, a dignity that deserves to be respected, a humanity that deserves to be seen. The city continued its frantic routine, millions of people crossing paths daily without truly seeing one another. But at that corner, near the subway station, something had changed. A small epicenter of humanity had been created, proving that, even in the most impersonal concrete jungles, genuine human connection can flourish. And somewhere in a battered notebook, the Thomas Reynolds wrote, "Day 547. The journey continues. The bridges multiply. Social invisibility remains a monumental challenge, but not an insurmountable one. Every story shared is a crack in the wall of indifference. Every connection made is a victory against isolation. The work continues." 6 months had passed since the start of the reporting project. Life at the corner had settled into a new normal. The Thomas Reynolds still maintained his daily presence, but now with a broader network of support and purpose. Emily Watson visited regularly, no longer as a journalist in search of a story, but as a friend and collaborator in social initiatives that had emerged from the project. It was during one of these visits that she found the Thomas Reynolds particularly agitated. He held a folder with documents, his hands trembling slightly, not from cold or age, but from contained emotion. "Emily Watson, I'm glad you came. I need your opinion on something." He opened the folder, revealing handwritten pages covered with his distinctive handwriting. "I received an offer. A private university wants to create a chair of applied social studies. They want me to lead it." Emily Watson examined the documents. The proposal was generous, not only financially but in terms of academic freedom and research resources. Thomas Reynolds, this is wonderful. It's the recognition of your unique work. It's a gilded cage, he replied, conflict evident in his voice. How can I accept a position that would take me away from those who taught me everything that truly matters? But think about the reach you would have. You could train a new generation of researchers with a different perspective. The Thomas Reynolds walked to his usual bench, Emily Watson following him. The morning was busy, with hurried workers ignoring, as always, the invisible people of the city. You know what Sir Antonio told me yesterday? That I was the only doctor who ever treated him like a person, not as an object of study. How can I maintain that from inside a university? Maybe, Emily Watson suggested carefully, the question isn't whether to choose one or the other, but finding a way to do both. Both. He repeated the word, savoring its implications. My daughter said something similar, suggested that I negotiate unconventional terms. Like what? Classes concentrated on some days, the rest of the time in the field, bringing the street into the classroom and the students into the street, breaking down the barriers between theory and practice. In an institutional way, Emily Watson smiled. That sounds revolutionary and sounds like you. Alice Turner approached with her usual dignity, interrupting the conversation. Thomas Reynolds, I need help. They're trying to remove our camp from the square. They say it's a court order, but no one shows us documents. Immediately, the Thomas Reynolds shifted into action mode. You have the right to see the order. I'll go with you. Emily Watson, can you accompany us? It would be good to have witnesses. As they walked, Emily Watson observed the Thomas Reynolds navigate between his multiple roles, academic, activist, friend, with natural fluency. At the square, he assessed the situation, spoke with the officials, cited specific laws, demanded proper procedures. His authority came not from credentials, but from knowledge and presence. The removal is illegal without prior notification and an offer of alternatives, he calmly explained to the responsible officer. Municipal Law 15.524, Article 7. Moreover, there are children and elderly people here. The Child and Adolescent Statute and the Elderly Statute require special protection. The officer, clearly unprepared for such legal knowledge coming from someone in worn clothes, hesitated. I'll check with my superiors. As they waited, the Thomas Reynolds organized the residents, explained their rights, calmed tensions. Emily Watson discreetly documented, already thinking about how this situation could become a practical lesson for future social workers. See? The Thomas Reynolds said softly to her. This is applied knowledge. There's no point in writing articles about human rights if we're not here when violations happen. The situation was temporarily resolved, the removal postponed, pending proper legal verification. But the incident crystallized something for the Thomas Reynolds. I'll accept the chair, he announced on the way back, but with conditions. Half the time in the field, half in class. Students must be involved in practical work, and a free legal assistance center operating from the university. Will they accept? If they want to revolutionize social science education, they'll have to accept revolutionary methods. There was renewed determination in his voice. In the following weeks, negotiations progressed. The university, surprisingly, proved open to unconventional proposals. The Thomas Reynolds case had gained international academic notoriety. Articles about his total immersion methodology were discussed at conferences, his approach cited as an example of truly participatory research. Emily Watson followed the process, fascinated by the transformation. The Thomas Reynolds maintained his street routine, but now dedicated a few hours to planning curricula, developing methodologies, building bridges between two worlds that traditionally remained separate. You know what's most ironic? He shared during one of their meetings. I spent years fleeing academia because I found it disconnected from reality. Now I'm going back precisely to connect it. The news spread through the street community. Reactions were mixed. Some feared losing their advocate. Others saw opportunity. The Thomas Reynolds is going to abandon us, Michael Carter murmured, the insecurity of abandonment always present. On the contrary, the Thomas Reynolds replied firmly, I'm bringing reinforcements. Imagine dozens of young people learning from you, providing support, creating sustainable support networks. Lucas Evans, the artist, was more optimistic. Can you teach classes on street art? About how creativity survives under adverse conditions? Not only can I, you'll teach those classes with me. The promise made the young man's eyes shine. David Johnson appeared with equipment to document these moments of transition. History is being made, he said. It needs to be recorded. The day of the first class approached. The Thomas Reynolds divided his time between preparing academic material and keeping his street commitments. Emily Watson found him one night reviewing notes by the light of a lamppost, surrounded by his battered notebooks. "Nervous?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "It's easier to face the cold and hunger than a room full of young people waiting for wisdom." You have wisdom in abundance. I have experiences. If that translates into wisdom, only time will tell. The first class was an event. The room was packed, not only with enrolled students, but with curious onlookers, other professors, even some familiar faces from the street whom the Thomas Reynolds had invited as specialized consultants. The Thomas Reynolds entered wearing the same clothes as always, a silent statement that he would not change his essence to fit academic expectations. The initial silence was tense, broken when Alice Turner, sitting in the front row, applauded. Others followed, turning the moment into a standing ovation. "Welcome," the Thomas Reynolds began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has lived what they teach, "to the course in Applied Social Studies. I warn you from the start, this will not be a conventional course. I am not here to teach abstract theories, but to share concrete realities." He walked around the room, making eye contact with every person. "Do you see that lady? Alice Turner was a school principal for 20 years before the system failed her. That young man? Lucas Evans creates art that rivals any gallery, using materials you throw in the trash. Everyone here has knowledge that no book can teach." A student timidly raised their hand. "Thomas Reynolds, how will we be evaluated?" "Great question. You will be evaluated not by tests but by impact. Each of you will choose a practical project, legal assistance, educational program, cultural initiative, and develop it with our partner community. Your success will be measured in lives touched, not in abstract grades." Murmurs swept through the room. It was radical, unconventional, potentially chaotic. It was perfect. The class continued with the Thomas Reynolds alternating between sociological theory and lived examples. When he spoke about social exclusion, Michael Carter shared his experience of losing everything. When discussing urban resilience, Lucas Evans showcased his works. Academia met the street in real time. Emily Watson, observing from the back of the room, marveled at the transformation. The Thomas Reynolds had found a way to honor both aspects of his identity, the rigorous academic and the committed activist. After class, a group of students surrounded the Thomas Reynolds with questions. Others chatted excitedly with the street guests, social barriers dissolving through genuine dialogue. It was a young student searched for words. Different from anything I've experienced at university, I felt like I was learning not just about social problems, but about real people. "That's the goal," the Thomas Reynolds replied, "to transform social problems into faces, names, stories. It's impossible to dehumanize those you know personally." In the following weeks, the course evolved organically. Students began to spend time on the corner, not as distant observers, but as participants. Projects took shape. One group created free legal advice, another organized training workshops, a third developed a mentoring program. The impact spread. Other departments requested lectures. Universities invited the Thomas Reynolds to share his methodology. Academic articles were written about the pedagogical revolution of the street. But the Thomas Reynolds kept his feet firmly planted in both worlds, 3 days a week at the university, 4 on the street. When asked about the fatigue of this double life, he smiled. "It's not a double life, it's a complete life." Emily Watson decided to write a book about the experience, not just about the Thomas Reynolds, but about everyone involved, the invisible who became visible, the students who became activists, the university that became truly community-oriented. "What will you call it?" the Thomas Reynolds asked when she shared the idea. "Human bridges when academia meets the street," Emily Watson replied. "I like it, but remember, the true bridges aren't the people, but the connections between them." The project continued to grow. Former students of the Thomas Reynolds began to replicate the model in other cities. Public policies were influenced by the data collected. More importantly, hundreds of lives were directly impacted, both those living on the streets and those who learned to truly see them. A year after the program began, a celebration event was held. The university auditorium was unrecognizable. Lucas Evans's works decorated the walls, Alice Turner coordinated the reception, Michael Carter managed logistics. It was impossible to distinguish who was from the street and who was from academia. Everyone was simply participants in a transformative experience. The Thomas Reynolds took the stage for the keynote speech. For a moment he stood in silence, observing the diverse audience, his daughter in the front row, smiling proudly, Emily Watson and David Johnson documenting, Sue Richard Stevens serving, coffee to deans, street residents chatting with international researchers. "A few years ago," he began, "I made a decision that many considered madness. I left the comfort of academia to live on the streets, seeking to understand what years of study hadn't taught me. I lost a lot in this journey: time with family, material comfort, professional status." He paused, emotion evident in his voice. "But what I gained, what we all gained, is immeasurable. We learned that knowledge without experience is empty, that dignity is independent of circumstances, that the greatest lessons come from the most unlikely teachers." Applause interrupted his speech. When it quieted, he continued, "This program is not about me. It's about proving that when we break down the artificial barriers between us and them, between theory and practice, between academia and community, miracles happen." He gestured to the audience. "Look around. Every person here is living proof that change is possible, not through condescending charity or distant studies, but through genuine human connection and mutual respect." The event continued late into the night, a celebration not only of successes achieved but of future possibilities. Emily Watson circulated, collecting testimonials for her book, amazed at the transformation she had witnessed. "You know," David Johnson said to her at one point, "when we started that prank program, I never imagined it would end like this." "Neither did I," Emily Watson admitted. "We were looking for a 15-minute story. We found a silent revolution." The Thomas Reynolds approached them in the final moments of the night. He looked tired but satisfied, the weight of the years on, the street visible but tempered by the realization of purpose. "Thank you," he simply said. "You were the first to see beyond the surface. Without your initial curiosity, none of this would have happened." "We thank you, Thomas Reynolds," Emily Watson replied, "for teaching us to see." As the event ended and people dispersed, the Thomas Reynolds remained on the empty stage for a moment. His journey was far from over. There were still classes to teach, lives to touch, bridges to build, but something fundamental had changed. He was no longer alone in his mission. He had created a network, a movement, a new way of thinking and acting. He left the auditorium and walked through the familiar streets back to his corner. Some habits were hard to break, and he still enjoyed the quiet hours of dawn for reflection. He sat down on his usual bench, opened his battered notebook, and wrote, Day 823. The seed planted in unlikely soil has flourished beyond expectations. The personal journey has transformed into a collective movement. Social invisibility remains a monumental challenge, but no longer faced in isolation. Every student who learns, to see every bridge built, every life transformed is a victory against systemic indifference. The work continues, but now with hope grounded in concrete results. The silent revolution gains voice. He closed the notebook and watched the city fall asleep. Springfield, with all its contrasts and contradictions, had been his laboratory, his classroom, his home. And it would continue to be, because some journeys have no final destination, only continuous transformations. Emily Watson would publish her book. The program would expand. Lives would continue to be transformed. But that silent dawn, the Thomas Reynolds was just a man on a bench, a guardian of stories, a builder of bridges. a living proof that sometimes one must lose oneself completely to find true purpose. And somewhere in the city, dozens of people slept with renewed hope, knowing they were no longer invisible, that their stories mattered, that change, slow, difficult but real, was possible. It was the legacy of a man who chose to descend from his ivory tower, not to observe but to live, love and transform. And in the process, he transformed himself and everyone around him. 2 years had passed since that first revolutionary class. The Applied Social Studies program had become an international reference, attracting researchers and students from various countries interested in understanding and replicating the model. The Thomas Reynolds maintained his peculiar routine, dividing his time between the university and the streets, refusing to completely abandon either world. Emily Watson had successfully launched her book, generating important debates about research methodologies and academic social responsibility. But it was on a regular Tuesday afternoon that the true test of all the built work presented itself. The Thomas Reynolds was in his makeshift office, a table in the corner of the university library, always with open doors, when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was tense. It was the new mayor of the city, known for her controversial policies regarding the homeless population. Dr. Alcantara, we need to talk. There is a proposal in the chamber to criminalize sleeping in public spaces. I would like your opinion before the vote. The Thomas Reynolds closed his eyes for a moment. It was the kind of setback he feared. Years of work to humanize could be undone by a cruel law. When can we meet? Now, if possible. My office in an hour? He agreed and immediately called Emily Watson. I need you and David Johnson. And bring some of our street collaborators. It's time to put all our work to the test. An hour later, an unusual group entered the mayor's office. The Thomas Reynolds in his simple but clean clothes, Emily Watson, and David Johnson with discreet equipment, Alice Turner in her best dress, Lucas Evans with a folder of drawings, Michael Carter nervous but determined. The mayor, a middle-aged woman with an efficient air, seemed surprised by the entourage. Doctor, I expected only you. With all due respect, Madam Mayor, decisions about people in street situations must include their voices. These are some of the most qualified consultants on the subject. A tense moment passed before she nodded. Very well, please everyone sit down. The Thomas Reynolds began with concrete data, statistics collected over the years, analyses of similar policies in other cities and their failures, the human and economic costs of criminalization. But it was the personal testimonies that changed the atmosphere in the room. Alice Turner spoke about losing her home after her husband's death and impossible medical expenses. Michael Carter described the downward spiral after losing his job during the economic crisis. Lucas Evans explained how the street became a refuge when his family rejected him. You understand, the Thomas Reynolds concluded, that criminalizing poverty does not solve it. It only pushes it into the shadows, making it even harder to help these people. The mayor remained silent, clearly impacted. But the merchants complain residents feel unsafe. Insecurity comes from the unknown, Lucas Evans politely interrupted. When people know us, fear disappears. May I show you? He opened his folder, revealing portraits he had made of local merchants interacting positively with homeless individuals. These are the same ones who supposedly complain. But look, Mr. Richard Stevens serving coffee, Mrs. Maria from the market guarding, fruits the bank security teaching chess to Zay. Emily Watson seized the moment. Madam Mayor, what if instead of criminalization we proposed integration? Work programs, transitional housing, psychosocial support. Our program at the university has already proven to work on a small scale. Interesting. But the cost? It's less than the cost of arresting, prosecuting, and keeping these people in the prison system. The Thomas Reynolds presented a detailed spreadsheet. Besides the incalculable human cost. The meeting extended for 3 hours. By the end, the mayor was visibly different from when they began. You've given me a lot to think about. Dr. Alcantara, would you accept to lead a committee to develop alternatives? I accept, on the condition that half the members are people with street experience. That is unconventional. Like Everything we do, the Thomas Reynolds smiled, but it is effective. They left the office with a firm commitment. In the elevator, Michael Carter could not contain his emotion. She heard us. She really heard us. Because you spoke with the authority of lived experience, Emily Watson observed. No expert could have been more convincing. The committee was formed and began intensive work. Meetings took place both in official rooms and in public squares. Policies were designed not about the people, but with them. David Johnson documented the entire process, creating powerful educational material. "This is real democracy," he commented, after a particularly productive session. Not just voting every 4 years, but daily participation in decisions that affect lives. The work was not easy. There was resistance from conservative sectors, moments of tension when interests conflicted, but the Thomas Reynolds navigated masterfully, always bringing the focus back to the human behind the statistics. One night, after a particularly difficult meeting where business owners had been hostile, the Thomas Reynolds found himself again on his familiar corner. Emily Watson found him there, visibly exhausted. "Sometimes I wonder," he said, "if it was simpler when I just observed and took notes." "But less meaningful," Emily Watson replied, sitting beside him. "True, you know, my daughter told me something yesterday, that she's proud of me but worried, that I give too much of myself." Is she right? Probably. But how can I do less, when so much is at stake? A month later, the final proposal was presented. Instead of criminalization, a comprehensive support program, transitional housing, professional training, mental health care, community integration. The cost was significant, but lower than the punitive alternatives. The day of the vote in the chamber was tense, packed galleries with supporters on both sides. The Thomas Reynolds spoke on behalf of the committee, but it was again the personal testimonies that made the difference. Lucas Evans showcased his artwork, now recognized in galleries. Michael Carter spoke as the coordinator of a professional reintegration program. Alice Turner ran a transitional shelter. They were living proofs that investing in people yields returns. The vote was tight, but the proposal passed. Applause erupted in the galleries. The Thomas Reynolds remained quiet, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. Years of silent work had culminated in concrete political change. "We did it," Emily Watson whispered, tears in her eyes. "We started," he corrected. "Implementation will be the true challenge." And it was. In the following months, the program faced bureaucratic obstacles, institutional resistance, public skepticism. But the network built over the years proved its strength. Students became volunteers, sensitized business owners offered jobs, communities opened up to integration. The Thomas Reynolds oversaw everything with tireless dedication. His health, already fragile from years on the streets, began to take its toll. One afternoon he collapsed during class. The diagnosis was severe exhaustion. Body and mind had been pushed to the limit. Forced to rest, he initially resisted. "There's so much work," he protested from his hospital bed, "and there will continue to be." His daughter, now a constant presence, insisted, "But you built something bigger than a person. Trust the network you created." And the network responded. Students took over classes, street collaborators led workshops. Emily Watson coordinated the continuity of the projects. The work not only continued, it flourished with new leadership emerging. During recovery, the Thomas Reynolds had time for deep reflection. He wrote prolifically, not only academic analyses but personal memories, philosophical reflections on his journey. "I learned," he wrote in a particularly touching essay, "that true social transformation does not come from heroic individuals, but from awakened communities. My role was merely to ignite the first flame. The fire that spread belongs to all who chose to feed it." 6 months later, in a simple but meaningful ceremony, the first complete class of the program graduated. The Thomas Reynolds, recovered but visibly marked by the journey, handed out diplomas with paternal pride. "You are not just graduates," he said to the graduates. "You are bridge builders, translators between worlds, agents of real change. Wherever you go, carry the fundamental lesson. Knowledge without compassion is empty. Compassion without action is insufficient. Among the graduates, a surprise: Michael Carter, who had completed the course as a special student. From homeless to graduate, his journey symbolized the transformative power of genuine opportunity. Emily Watson, now working on her second book, watched the ceremony with emotion. David Johnson, officially retired but always present with his camera, captured moments for posterity. "It's a beautiful ending," David Johnson commented. "It's not an ending," Emily Watson corrected. "It's multiplication. Each graduate will carry this forward." And they did. In the following years, similar programs emerged in dozens of cities. Alumni became leaders in social movements, public policies, community organizations. The Thomas Reynolds' methodology was studied, adapted, expanded. But the deeper impact was less measurable. The change in how society viewed its most vulnerable members. Where there had once been fear and indifference, understanding and solidarity grew, not universally, not completely, but enough to make a real difference in thousands of lives. The Thomas Reynolds continued his work, albeit at a more sustainable pace. He maintained an office at the university, but spent afternoons at the familiar corner, available to talk with anyone in need. His beard was grayer, his step slower, but his eyes retained the sparkle of someone who had found purpose. On a particular afternoon, sitting on his usual bench, he was approached by a young reporter working on a story about the 10th anniversary of the program. Thomas Reynolds, looking back, was it worth it? The personal sacrifices? He contemplated the question, observing the movement of the street. Mr. Richard Stevens still serving coffee, new faces mingling with old, students talking with homeless individuals without visible barriers. "You know," he finally replied, "I spent years seeking to understand social exclusion. I read all the theories, analyzed all the data, but it was only when I allowed myself to be excluded that I truly understood. And from that understanding, not only knowledge but transformative action was born." He paused, smiling at some particular memory. "I lost years with my family, material comfort, conventional prestige, but I gained an extended family, a wealth of purpose, genuine respect. More importantly, I was part of proving that change is possible, that walls between us and them can fall." The young reporter, clearly moved, asked more questions, but Emily Watson, watching from afar, knew that the most eloquent words would not fully capture the magnitude of the journey. It was necessary to have witnessed the transformation, not just of the Thomas Reynolds, but of all those touched by his radical choice to live his object of study. When the interview ended and the reporter left, Emily Watson approached. "Still winning hearts and minds, Thomas Reynolds?" "Just planting seeds, Emily Watson, as always." They sat together on the familiar bench, two veterans of a silent war against indifference. The sun was setting, painting the city golden, and for a moment Springfield seemed less cruel, more human. "You know what's most extraordinary?" the Thomas Reynolds said softly. "I began this journey seeking academic answers. I found something much greater, confirmation that deep down, despite all artificial divisions, we are one humanity. And when we allow ourselves to see that, everyday miracles happen." Emily Watson nodded, understanding deeply. It had been years of discoveries, challenges, transformations. The Thomas Reynolds' story had intertwined with dozens, hundreds of other stories, creating a rich tapestry of resistance, hope, and change. And the story continued. Because true revolution does not happen in dramatic explosions, but in the patient accumulation of small acts of recognition, compassion, and justice. The Thomas Reynolds had started a chain that would continue to spread, touching lives, changing perspectives, building bridges. As night fell over the city, the Thomas Reynolds opened his notebook, now one among many his writings preserved and studied, and made one last entry for the day. Day 3650, 10 years since the decision. The journey has turned out differently than planned, harder, richer, more transformative. The initial question about how to study social exclusion found an unexpected answer. One does not study, one lives, shares, transforms together. The work continues, now carried by many hands, hearts and minds. Social invisibility remains a challenge, but is no longer accepted as inevitable. Every day, more people choose to see, and in seeing truly lies the seed of all change. The silent revolution has become a chorus. May it continue to grow. He closed the notebook, stored it carefully, and got up. There was a class to prepare, people to meet, bridges to continue building. The work of a lifetime, not the one he had planned, but the one he had discovered was necessary. And somewhere in the city, someone in a vulnerable situation found an outstretched hand, not in charity, but in recognition of shared humanity. It was the living legacy of a man who chose to descend from his tower to rise in understanding, and in the process elevated everyone around him. The story of the Thomas Reynolds of the streets had become the story of a city learning to see its invisibles, and that, Emily Watson knew as she walked alongside him through the familiar streets, was the true revolution, silent, persistent, unstoppable as life itself. The 25th anniversary of the Thomas Reynolds' journey was approaching. Emily Watson, now a renowned writer and director of an applied social research institute, was organizing a special event. It would not just be a celebration, but a moment for deep reflection on the impact of a man who chose an unconventional path. The Thomas Reynolds, at 75, remained active, though at a slower pace. He still visited the corner weekly, but now accompanied by his daughter, Sophia Clark, who had become a doctor specializing in the health of vulnerable populations, a direct inspiration from her father's journey. "Dad, are you sure you want to give the speech?" Sophia Clark asked as she helped him prepare for the event. "We can ask Emily Watson or one of the former students to do it." "Some words need to come from the source," he replied, adjusting the E. Same worn jacket he had worn for decades. "Besides, I have an important announcement." The university auditorium was transformed. Works by Lucas Evans, now an internationally recognized artist, adorned the walls. Stands showcased projects, developed by alumni on 5 continents. A documentary produced by David Johnson was playing on a loop, showing the evolution of the movement over the years. Emily Watson took the stage for the opening. 25 years ago, I was a young reporter looking for a sensational story. I found a Thomas Reynolds who taught me the difference between observing and seeing, between reporting and understanding, between knowledge and wisdom. She paused, evident emotion in her voice. Today, we celebrate not just a man, but a movement that transformed the way our society sees and treats its most vulnerable members. But let's let the numbers speak first. A presentation showed the quantifiable impact: 50,000 people directly assisted by the programs, 500 organizations created by alumni, 30 cities with public policies based on the model, countless lives transformed. But it was the personal testimonies that touched deeply. Michael Carter, now the director of a national professional reintegration network, spoke about his journey from executive to homeless and then to social leader. Alice Turner, at 80, still active, managed a transitional housing complex that had housed thousands. Lucas Evans showcased his latest work, a giant mural depicting the Thomas Reynolds surrounded by hundreds of faces, each representing a touched life. Students from various countries shared how the model had been adapted to their cultures. A Japanese Thomas Reynolds spoke about programs in Tokyo. A South African activist described initiatives in Johannesburg. A Mexican researcher presented results in Mexico City. What began on a corner in Springfield, Emily Watson observed, has become a global movement, but it retains its essence, genuine human connection, as the foundation for social transformation. Finally, it was the Thomas Reynolds' moment to speak. Helped by Sophia Clark, he ascended the stage amidst prolonged applause. The silence that followed was thick with expectation and respect. "My friends," he began, his voice still strong, "despite his age, when I left my previous life 25 years ago, I believed I was embarking on an academic research project. What magnificent naivety!" Soft laughter rippled through the audience. He continued, "I discovered that one cannot study life. One can only live it, and by living it fully we learn more than any methodology could teach." His eyes scanned the audience, recognizing faces from decades of journey. But today I am not here to talk about the past. I am here to talk about the future. Sophia Clark moved closer, concerned about her father's visible effort. He waved for her to wait. For years I kept a secret, something I discovered at the beginning of this journey but needed the right time to reveal. He paused dramatically. When I lived on the streets, I was not just observing, I was documenting every story, every life, every moment of transformation. Murmurs of surprise filled the auditorium. The Thomas Reynolds raised his hand for silence. Over these years, he continued, I compiled not just academic observations, but something much more precious, the authentic voices of those society silences. There are more than 3,000 detailed stories, documented with permission waiting to be heard. Gasps of astonishment echoed. The Thomas Reynolds raised his hand again, asking for quiet. But there's more. During my absence from conventional life, I continued something I had started before, a longitudinal study on social transformation. Only instead of observing from the outside, I became part of it. And now, after 25 years, the results are complete. He signaled to Emily Watson, who climbed the stage with a box. Inside were dozens of bound notebooks, thousands of pages of observations, analyses, stories. This is my true legacy, the Thomas Reynolds said. Not the policies we influenced, or the programs we created, important as they are, but these preserved voices, these proofs that every person has a story worthy of being told and heard. David Johnson, emotional, filmed every moment. His final documentary would have an ending he never imagined. But why reveal it now? Someone asked from the audience. The Thomas Reynolds smiled. Because it is time for the final phase, Emily. Watson, he turned to her. You always wanted to tell the complete story. Now you can. These notebooks are yours, ours, to transform into something that reaches beyond this room, beyond this city. Emily Watson could hardly speak. Thomas Reynolds, it is what it has always been. A story about humanity. About how the simple act of truly seeing the other can transform worlds. He paused, catching his breath. But there is one last thing. Sophia Clark stepped closer again. This time he accepted her support. My health is not what it once was. The years on the streets, however transformative they were, have taken their toll. The doctors, including my stubborn daughter here, say I need to rest, really rest. A heavy silence fell over the audience. So this is also a farewell, not to the work that will continue through all of you, but to the front lines. It is time to pass the baton completely. Tears flowed freely down many faces. The Thomas Reynolds raised his hand. Do not cry for me. Celebrate what we have built together. And more importantly, keep building. Because as long as there is an invisible person in our cities, the work will not be complete. He began naming successors, former students who would lead different aspects of the movement, homeless individuals who became experts, academics who embraced the revolutionary methodology. And to coordinate everything, he announced, there is no one better than the one who first saw beyond appearances. Emily Watson, will you accept to lead the Thomas Reynolds of the Streets Institute? Emily Watson, in tears, could only nod. The event continued, but the crucial moment had passed. The Thomas Reynolds had officially transferred his mission to the hundreds of hands willing to carry it forward. Later, in a private moment, Emily Watson flipped through the notebooks with reverence. Each page was a treasure, meticulous observations intertwined with deep reflections, sketches of captured moments, transcripts of conversations revealing unexpected wisdoms. How long have you been planning this? She asked. Since the day you showed up with your fake job offer, the Thomas Reynolds confessed. I saw in you the storyteller that these voices needed. All these years, was it a test? It was preparation. You needed to understand deeply before you could translate. Now you do. Sophia Clark gently interrupted. Dad needs to rest. It has been a long day. As they prepared to leave, the Thomas Reynolds held Emily Watson's hand. One last thing. In the last notebook, there is something special. Read it when you are alone. That night, Emily Watson found the message. It was a letter addressed to her. Emily Watson, when you read this, our joint journey will have reached its apex. But remember, the end of one story is always the beginning of another. You once asked me if it was worth it. Now I ask you, knowing everything you know, living everything you have lived, would you change anything? The notebooks contain facts, but you possess something more valuable. The understanding of how facts become truths, how truths become changes. Use this knowledge wisely. My greatest discovery is not written in any notebook. It is that love, not romantic love, but agape, unconditional love for humanity, is the only force capable of true social transformation. Everything else is technique. Love is the essence. Keep loving, keep seeing, keep building bridges. And when in doubt, remember, a person who chooses to see can start a revolution. With eternal gratitude, the eternal learner whom some call Thomas Reynolds. Emily Watson closed the notebook, tears smudging the last words. Outside, Springfield pulsed with its usual chaotic energy, but something fundamental had changed over the years. On the corners, in the squares, in the alleyways, people who were once invisible were now seen. Not by everyone, not always, but enough to make a difference. In the following months, Emily Watson dove into the work of organizing and publishing the stories. Each notebook revealed new layers of understanding. The Thomas Reynolds had created not just a record, but a masterpiece of participant observation. The first volume, Visible Voices, became an editorial phenomenon. But more than sales, it generated movement. Reading clubs discussed the stories. Schools included excerpts in the curriculum. Politicians quoted passages in debates. Lucas Evans created a traveling exhibition based on the stories, bringing faces and voices to museums and public spaces. David Johnson produced a documentary series, each episode focusing on a different story. Michael Carter developed training programs based on the documented survival strategies. The Thomas Reynolds followed everything from his new home, a modest but comfortable apartment, where he received constant visits. His health fluctuated, but his spirit remained vibrant. "I never imagined I would get this far," he confessed to Emily Watson during a visit. "You underestimated the power of what you built," she replied, "or rather, of what you taught us to build." A year after the anniversary event, the official inauguration of the Thomas Reynolds of the Streets Institute took place. The building, donated by a businessman touched by the stories, was ironically on the same street as the famous corner. The Thomas Reynolds, now in a wheelchair but with still bright eyes, cut the symbolic ribbon. "May this place always be a bridge, never a wall," he declared. The institute became the nerve center of a global network. Researchers came to study the methodology. Activists sought inspiration. More importantly, vulnerable people found not just help but dignity and voice. Emily Watson, as director, ensured that the original spirit remained. Every decision was filtered through the question, does this build bridges or walls? The Thomas Reynolds lived to see the release of the 10th volume of the stories. Each book revealed new facets of the human experience on the margins of society. Academics analyzed, artists drew inspiration, policies were reformulated. But the deepest impact was personal. Thousands of letters arrived from readers sharing how the stories had changed their way of seeing the world. Former prejudiced individuals confessed transformations, people inspired to act locally. "It is the revolution I have always dreamed of," the Thomas Reynolds told Sophia Clark on a quiet afternoon. Not violent, not sudden, but inexorable like the tide. His last public lecture was broadcast globally. Fragile yet determined, he spoke for an hour about radical compassion, about the courage to see, about the responsibility to act. "Do not let my story be about an extraordinary man doing extraordinary things," he insisted. "My story is about an ordinary man who chose to see. Anyone can make that choice. Everyone should." He ended with words that would become the mantra of the movement. "Social invisibility is not a natural condition. It is a collective choice. Choose to see. Choose to act. Choose to love." The Thomas Reynolds passed away peacefully on a winter morning, Sophia Clark holding his hand. His last words were to her, I cared for strangers, thank you for caring for me. His funeral became a spontaneous celebration event. Thousands attended, academics and activists, politicians and poets, but mostly ordinary people whose lives he had touched. The procession passed by the famous corner, where flowers piled up in an improvised memorial. Emily Watson spoke on behalf of all. He taught us that true revolutions happen when we choose to see each other as truly human. His life was proof that one person can make a difference, not despite their radical choices, but because of them. The work continued, stronger than ever. The Institute expanded. The publications reached dozens of languages. More importantly, the philosophy of seeing and being seen, of knowing by living, of transforming by loving, spread like seeds in the wind. Years later, Emily Watson, now elderly, visited the corner maintained as a memorial. A discreet plaque marked the spot where it all began. Young students conducted field research. Homeless individuals shared stories. Life continued in its infinite complexity. A young reporter approached her. "Mrs. Emily Watson, how would you sum up the Thomas Reynolds' legacy?" She smiled, recalling when she was the young one asking questions. He proved that the greatest possible revolution is to make the invisible visible, and that we all have that power. We just have to choose to use it. The reporter asked more questions, but Emily Watson gently interrupted him. Don't ask me about him. Go over there, talk to those people, listen to their stories, truly see them, then tell me what you learned." As the young man walked away, hesitant but curious, Emily Watson smiled. The revolution continued. One conversation, one glance, one bridge at a time. At the Institute, a new generation of bridge builders was forming. In the preserved notebooks of the Thomas Reynolds, researchers found insights yet to be explored. In the streets of cities worldwide, people chose to see, and somewhere someone in a vulnerable situation was truly seen for the first time, not as a problem to be solved or a statistic to be catalogued, but as a complex, unique, valuable human being. It was the everyday miracle that the Thomas Reynolds had made possible. The story was coming to an end, but the movement he had inspired was just beginning. Because some truths once revealed cannot be forgotten, and the truth that the Thomas Reynolds lived and taught was simple and revolutionary. We are all one, and when we act based on that truth, worlds are transformed. Emily Watson closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the presence of her friend and mentor. Then she opened them and saw the city with eyes he had taught her to see, not as an impersonal concrete jungle, but as a living tapestry of intertwined stories, each precious, each deserving to be told. The silent revolution had become a symphony. And the music continued, note by note, story by story, transformation by transformation. The Thomas Reynolds of the streets had departed, but his lesson remained eternal. Choose to see, choose to love, choose to transform. The rest is inevitable consequence. The end.